The desert wind carried a sound that was sharper than gunfire, the crack of a whip cutting through flesh and silence. On the barren trail, under the merciless sun, a woman stumbled forward, her back marked by violence, her spirit still burning despite the cruelty she endured. She was not just running from chains. She was running toward a chance to breathe, to live, to reclaim what the West had stolen from her. And it was in that moment, as dust swirled and the horizon blurred, that a lone cowboy watched from the saddle, his heart struck with a weight heavier than steel. He had seen many battles, many injustices in the wild frontier, but this he could not turn away from. The West was a land of unforgiving rules, where men often chose silence over justice and survival over compassion. Yet in that instant, the cowboy knew that looking away would bind him to the same cruelty that lashed across her skin. His hand gripped the reins tighter, not out of fear, but out of the certainty that his life was about to change forever. What he was about to do could cost him his home, his freedom, perhaps even his life. But some sights burn so deeply into the soul that they leave no room for hesitation. The woman's eyes met his briefly, eyes clouded with pain, yet lit by a fire that no whip could extinguish. In that fleeting glance, he saw not weakness, but defiance. She was not asking to be saved. She was daring the world to let her survive. That single moment tethered the cowboy's fate to hers, not by choice, but by a force older than law, stronger than fear, and as relentless as the western sun itself. Around them, the plains stretched wide and merciless, indifferent to suffering. The silence of the witnesses, the laughter of her tormentors, and the hollow echo of the whip became a scene that demanded a reckoning. The cowboy's breath caught in his chest, for he knew that the line between right and wrong in the West was as thin as the trigger of his revolver. Crossing it meant more than defiance, it meant war. And so the story begins, not with words of love or promises of gold, but with a choice to ride past and remain untouched by another's pain, or to step into a fight that could not be undone. The cowboy's spurs dug into his horse, his shadow stretching long across the burning earth, carrying him into a storm that would bind his destiny to the woman who refused to be broken. It was the kind of moment that births legends the West would never forget. The cowboy's decision was made in the silence between heartbeats. With a swift motion, he swung down from his horse, his boots striking the dirt with a weight that drew every gaze. The men who held the whip sneered, their laughter bitter with cruelty, but the cowboy's eyes did not flinch. In the West, where justice was scarce and mercy rarer still, moments like this carved the measure of a man. He had lived long enough to know that turning away would haunt him far longer than any scar. The woman staggered, blood tracing lines across her torn dress, yet her defiance held. She did not beg for rescue, nor cry for mercy. Instead, her silence spoke louder than their laughter, a silence that dared the world to break her spirit. The cowboy saw in her what the others could not, the unyielding strength of someone who had already endured more than they ever would. That strength lit something inside him, a fire he had not felt since the days when hope had not yet been buried beneath dust and loss. He stepped forward, placing himself between the woman and her tormentors. His hand hovered near the worn grip of his revolver, not yet drawn, but ready. The men taunted him, mocking his choice, warning him of the consequences. But the cowboy knew the unwritten laws of the West. Silence makes you an accomplice, and action makes you an enemy. There was no middle ground. His stance was his answer, and in that moment, the balance of power shifted. The whip cracked again, this time in the air, a threat meant to rattle him. But the cowboy did not move. His stillness carried more danger than fury. His silence was not weakness. It was the coiled strength of a rattlesnake before the strike. The woman, even through pain, lifted her head, her eyes locking on him, as if daring him not to falter. It was not gratitude she offered in that look. It was an unspoken pact. If he fought for her, she would fight to live. And so the standoff began, under the ruthless gaze of the western sun. A lone cowboy against men who believed cruelty was strength. Yet the West had always belonged not to the strongest, but to the fiercest spirits, those who could endure hunger, storms, and blood without breaking. In that truth, the cowboy knew he was not standing alone. He was standing with her, with a fire that no whip could silence. And together they were about to write a story that the land itself would remember. The first shot split the silence like thunder. Dust rose as horses reared and men scrambled, the cowboy's revolver now steady in his hand. He had drawn faster than their cruelty had expected, and the suddenness of his defiance shook them to the core. The woman stumbled back, her body weakened, but her eyes remained locked on the unfolding storm. For the first time, the lash was no longer in command. The man who dared to stand alone was. The outlaws regrouped, their laughter gone, replaced by curses and threats. They circle him like wolves, but wolves fear a man who does not fear them. The cowboy's voice cut through the chaos, low and unshaken, warning them once, only once, to leave her be. In the West, words carried weight not by volume, but by the man who spoke them. And in that moment, his voice carried the promise of death. One of them lunged, whip snapping like lightning toward his face. The cowboy fired, the crack echoing across the plains. The whip fell silent, its wielder sprawled in the dust. The others froze, the reality of his resolve sinking into their bones. Violence had always been their language, but he had spoken it fluently, reminding them that cruelty is nothing against conviction sharpened by necessity. The woman, though trembling, found her footing again. She moved closer, her hand pressing against her side, her breath ragged but her gaze steady. The cowboy glanced at her only once, and in that glance, something deeper than words passed between them. They were no longer strangers bound by chance. They were allies forged in fire, two souls tied by a single moment of defiance against the cruelty of men. At last, the remaining outlaws spat into the dirt, retreating with muttered curses, their pride wounded more than their flesh. They left with the threat of return, but the cowboy did not chase them. He knew the West never forgot debts, and blood always demanded more blood. For now, survival was enough. He turned to the woman, his revolver still smoking, and asked the only question that mattered in a land where stories lived longer than names. "Can you ride?" Her answer came not in words, but in the way she pulled herself upright, bloodied yet unbowed. She nodded once, her chin lifted with the same defiance that had carried her through the lash. The cowboy guided her toward his horse, a creature as weathered and scarred as its master, and without hesitation she mounted, gripping the saddle though her hands trembled. Pain carved into her features, but she did not waver. In that moment, the cowboy realized he was not rescuing her. He was riding beside someone whose spirit had already chosen survival over surrender. The trail stretched wide and merciless, the prairie winds carrying whispers of vengeance. He knew the men he had faced would not let the humiliation stand. The West was a land that thrived on pride, and pride wounded was more dangerous than hunger. Every hoofbeat echoed with the promise of pursuit, yet he pressed on, guiding her deeper into the valley where the land itself could shield them with its canyons and shadows. As they rode, he studied her in silence. She sat straight despite her injuries, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though daring it to break her. Few men had carried themselves with such grit under torment, and here was a woman, scarred yet unshaken, matching the very cruelty of the frontier with fire of her own. He had seen hardened gunfighters lose their will under less, but she seemed to draw strength from the pain, as though every lash had carved resilience in her bones. When they finally stopped to rest beneath a cluster of cottonwoods, the air was heavy with dust and the scent of blood. He offered her water from his canteen, but she drank sparingly, refusing to take more than what was needed. That gesture struck him deeply. In a land where survival often meant greed, she carried herself with honor. Even in hunger and pain, she chose dignity. And dignity, in the West, was rarer than gold. The cowboy realized then that this was no ordinary encounter, no passing act of mercy. The choice he had made to intervene had bound their paths together. The woman's survival was now tied to his, and his to hers. And in the stillness of that night, with coyotes howling in the distance, he understood that they were already part of a story greater than either of them had intended to live. Morning came with a bite of cold air and the uneasy silence of the plains. The cowboy rose before dawn, scanning the horizon with the eyes of a man who trusted little and expected worse. He knew the outlaws would not rest. Men like them did not forget humiliation, and the whip they carried would soon return with gun barrels and fire. Yet when he turned back, he found the woman awake, her wounds wrapped in strips of cloth torn from her dress, her resolve intact. She had not come to the West to be broken. She had come to fight for the right to exist. They rode again, pushing deeper into the rugged terrain, where the land itself seemed to hold secrets in its jagged cliffs and hidden trails. The cowboy said little, but his mind turned endlessly. He had spent years alone, carving survival out of silence, convinced that solitude was the only shield against the cruelty of the world. But now, riding beside her, he felt the stirring of something he thought long dead. Purpose. Not for land, not for cattle, but for another soul. By midday, they reached an abandoned cabin, half collapsed, its roof sagging beneath years of storms. It was shelter, fragile but necessary. As the woman stepped inside, her hands brushed the splintered walls, her gaze steady despite the ruin around them. She did not see a broken cabin. She saw a place to begin again. The cowboy, watching her claim the silence of the room, realized she was not just surviving. She was already rebuilding. The hours passed slowly, filled with the simple sounds of survival. Wood splitting under his axe, water boiling over the fire, her quiet breathing as she stitched her wounds. In those small acts, a rhythm was born, one that spoke not of chance but of inevitability. The West had thrown them together in blood and defiance, and now the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if they would endure. Yet beneath the fragile peace lingered the shadow of danger. The cowboy knew the men they had left behind were gathering strength, sharpening their vengeance. The woman knew it too, for each time the wind rattled the cabin's boards, her eyes flickered toward the door. Still, neither spoke of fear. Fear had no place in their story. Only endurance did, and endurance, in the Old West, was the true mark of legend. The peace of the cabin lasted only as long as the silence of the horizon. By the third night, the coyotes' cries were drowned by another sound, the faint thunder of hooves carried by the wind. The cowboy stiffened at once, his hand resting on the revolver that never left his side. He had known it would come. The outlaws would not forgive humiliation. Vengeance was as sure as sunrise in the West. The woman, hearing the distant rumble, rose slowly from her place near the fire. Her face bore no panic, only the same grim defiance that had marked her from the start. They doused the flames and moved into the darkness, the cabin now more a trap than a shelter. The cowboy led her to a ridge behind the cabin, where rocks and shadows could serve as allies. From there, they watched as riders appeared, 5 in number, their silhouettes framed against the rising moon. These men carried more than whips this time. They carried rifles, torches, and a raw hunger for revenge. The land around them seemed to hold its breath, the stillness before the storm. The cowboy's mind raced, not with fear, but with calculation. He could take down 2 before the others fired back, but survival would require more than bullets. He glanced at the woman, expecting hesitation, but instead he saw her grip a broken piece of wood like a weapon, her jaw set, her body crouched in readiness. She had no gun, no training, yet the fire in her eyes told him she had already chosen her place in the fight, by his side. When the outlaws dismounted and spread around the cabin, the cowboy struck first. His revolver cracked through the silence, a flash of fire against the night. One man fell instantly, another stumbled as a bullet grazed his shoulder. Chaos erupted, gunfire exploding in the stillness, horses screaming as they bolted into the brush. The woman hurled her wooden weapon with a force born of rage, striking one of the men squarely and buying the cowboy precious seconds to reload. The fight was fierce, brutal, and short. 2 outlaws lay dead in the dirt, the others retreating into the night with curses spilling from their lips. The cowboy's arm was grazed, blood soaking into his sleeve, but he did not falter. When the dust settled, the woman approached him, her breath ragged but her eyes alight. She had stood her ground, not as a victim, not as a burden, but as a fighter. In that moment, their bond was sealed by blood spilled onto the western stars. Dawn broke crimson, painting the plains as though the earth itself bore witness to the violence of the night. The cowboy's wound was shallow, but the woman insisted on binding it with strips torn from her dress. Her hands, though trembling, moved with care, her touch steady. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel something beyond survival, a flicker of trust, rare and dangerous in a land where trust could cost you your life. As they sat together outside the ruined cabin, silence wrapped around them, but it was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two souls who had stood together against the world and refused to break. The cowboy, hardened by years of solitude, felt the weight of his own words from long ago. The only offer is my last name. He had meant it once as a jest, perhaps even as a shield. But now, after fire and blood, it echoed as something deeper, a promise he was no longer certain he deserved to offer. The woman, gazing out at the endless horizon, spoke softly of her past for the first time. She told him of the chains she had fled, of the cruelty that had marked her skin but not her spirit. She spoke not with bitterness, but with a quiet strength that demanded respect. The cowboy listened, every word cutting into him like a blade. He realized that her scars were not just wounds. They were testimonies of survival, carved by the merciless hand of the West, yet worn with pride. Their journey was far from over. The outlaws who had fled would return with more men, and the land itself still threatened hunger, storms, and drought. But in her voice, in her steady gaze, the cowboy found something he had long thought lost, a reason worth fighting for beyond himself. The West was merciless, but perhaps that was why it demanded alliances forged not in convenience, but in fire. And so, as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the plains, the cowboy and the woman mounted his horse once more. They did not speak of what lay ahead, for words were fragile in the face of destiny. Instead, they rode together into the uncertain wild, two figures bound not by chance, but by the legend they were already becoming, etched into the memory of the land, written in scars, and carried on the wind. The road ahead was long and merciless, carved into the earth by generations of riders who had bled into its dust. The cowboy and the woman pressed forward, their shadows stretching across the plains like echoes of a story, still unfolding. Though his arm still burned with pain, and her back bore the scars of cruelty, neither faltered. In the silence between them, a bond deepened, an unspoken agreement that neither was alone anymore. The West had a way of testing every soul, but together they had found strength that neither could have summoned alone. They reached the edge of a canyon as twilight fell, the sky painted in strokes of fire and ash. The cowboy set up camp with the practiced rhythm of a man who had lived too long by the rules of survival, while the woman gathered brush for the fire, her movements graceful despite exhaustion. Each task they shared was simple, yet beneath it ran a truth as fierce as the desert wind. They were no longer two strangers bound by chance. They were allies shaped by blood and grit, destined to stand against whatever storm the horizon carried. That night, as the fire crackled low, the cowboy told her stories of his past, of the brothers he had buried, of the wars he had fought, of the silence he had embraced to keep the pain from consuming him. He did not share such words lightly, for in the West, every confession was a weapon that could one day be used against you. But with her, the words came like water from a long dry well, unbidden yet necessary. She listened without pity, her gaze steady, as though she understood that survival often meant carrying ghosts that never let go. In turn, she spoke of her dreams, not of wealth or revenge, but of something simpler, a life where fear did not dictate every step, a place where work brought dignity rather than chains. Her voice trembled with both hope and doubt, but the cowboy recognized the rare courage it took to dream in a land that devoured hope whole. Her words struck him deeper than any bullet, reminding him that perhaps the West was not only a land of death but also of rebirth, if one had the will to seize it. And so, under the endless sweep of stars, two scarred souls shared their truths by the firelight. Neither spoke of love, nor did they need to. In the Old West, love was not declared with words but proven through survival, through the willingness to stand side by side when the land itself seemed determined to erase you. That night, their silence was not heavy but sacred, a vow spoken without sound. Morning came with a warning in the wind. The cowboy's instincts, sharpened by years of hardship, told him they were no longer alone. Tracks in the dirt confirmed his fear. Riders had followed their trail, likely the outlaws who had fled the cabin, now regrouped and thirsting for blood. He knew they would come not as 5, but as many more. The woman, upon seeing the tracks, did not flinch. She tightened her grip on the small knife he had given her, her eyes steady. She had lived too long with fear to let it master her now. They prepared for the inevitable. The canyon's narrow paths became their shield, rocks and shadows their allies. The cowboy laid out his rifle, checked the chambers of his revolver, and mapped escape routes with the precision of a man who had faced too many battles. Yet, what struck him most was the woman's resolve. She did not cower in the shadows. Instead, she stood at his side, asking not what would happen if they failed, but what she could do when the fight began. As the sun climbed higher, the sound of hooves thundered once more, this time heavier, angrier, carrying with it the promise of vengeance. Dust rose on the horizon, revealing a dozen riders, their faces twisted with rage, their guns gleaming in the light. The cowboy felt the weight of the moment press down upon him. Alone, he could never withstand such odds. But he was not alone anymore. The woman's presence was as fierce as steel, her spirit unbreakable. Together, they would make the land itself remember their defiance. When the outlaws reached the canyon's mouth, a hush fell over the riders, the kind of silence that precedes death. The cowboy stepped forward, his rifle aimed, his figure outlined by the harsh light. Beside him, the woman gripped the rocks, ready to strike when the time came. In her eyes burned not desperation, but a fearless challenge, a fire that told every man before them that she would not bow again, not to whips, not to guns, not to cruelty. The standoff stretched like a blade held to the throat of fate. The West had always been cruel, devouring the weak and rewarding only those who dared defy it. And here, in the heart of the canyon, 2 souls stood against an army, bound not by chance but by destiny. The question was not whether they would survive the day, but whether their story would live on as legend, etched into the dust, carried by the wind, and remembered by every soul who heard of the woman who refused to be broken and the cowboy who could not turn away. The canyon roared to life with the first shot. The cowboy's rifle cracked against the silence, striking down the lead rider and sending chaos rippling through the outlaw ranks. Horses reared, dust churned, and the woman hurled rocks with the fury of someone who had nothing left to lose but her defiance. The air filled with gunfire, every echo bouncing off the canyon walls like thunder. Yet, amid the storm, the cowboy remained steady, his aim precise, his body moving with the cold rhythm of survival. The outlaws pressed forward, their numbers overwhelming, but the terrain betrayed them. Narrow paths forced them into lines, easy prey for the cowboy's rifle. The woman, crouched behind jagged stone, struck out whenever a rider drew too close, her hand steady despite the blood staining her skin. She was no bystander in this battle. Every move, every cry, every strike carved her deeper into the story they were writing with sweat and fire. Minutes stretched into lifetimes. The cowboy's ammunition dwindled, the barrel of his rifle searing hot. He switched to his revolver, firing until the chamber clicked empty. Still, the outlaws came, driven less by victory than by rage. In the chaos, one rider broke through, his whip snapping like a serpent as he lunged for the woman. She met him not with fear, but with fury, driving her knife into his arm and sending him sprawling into the dirt. Her eyes blazed, no longer the eyes of a victim, but of a fighter reborn. The cowboy caught her defiance even as he reloaded, a flicker of pride cutting through the blood and dust. She was no longer the woman he had first seen stumbling beneath the lash. She was a storm, her spirit unbreakable, her will burning brighter than the sun that scorched them both. In that moment, he realized that even if the canyon became their grave, their story had already outlived them. It was legend in the making. By the time the smoke cleared, the canyon floor was littered with the fallen. The surviving outlaws fled into the horizon, their vengeance drowned in defeat. The cowboy, bleeding from a cut across his temple, lowered his revolver at last. Beside him, the woman stood unshaken, her knife still dripping, her breath heavy but steady. Together, they had faced death and refused to yield. The land had tested them, and they had endured. The battle left a silence heavier than thunder. Dust settled over the canyon like a shroud, the only sound the labored breathing of horse and rider alike. The cowboy leaned against the stone, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the woman who stood just a few steps away. She, too, was exhausted, her body battered and scarred. Yet she carried herself with a strength that seemed to defy the cruelty of the world. The West had tried to break her, but it had only sharpened her into steel. As the sun dipped behind the canyon walls, painting the world in shades of gold and shadow, the cowboy felt the truth settle over him. He had not saved her. She had saved herself. What he had done was simply refuse to turn away. Yet, in refusing, he had found more than he had ever expected. A companion carved by the same storms, a soul whose fire matched his own solitude. In her, he saw not weakness, but a mirror of the resilience that had carried him all these years. They left the canyon together, their bodies aching, their spirits alight. The land stretched wide before them, endless and merciless, but no longer empty. Every hoofbeat carried a rhythm of defiance, a reminder that survival in the West was never promised, but always earned. The cowboy no longer thought of his words. The only offer is my last name. Now, he understood that names were not what bound souls together. Shared battles, shared scars, and shared silence were. That night, beneath the sweep of stars, they sat by the fire once more. Neither spoke of the men they had killed, nor the ones who might still return. The West would always carry danger, cruelty, and storms. But for the first time in years, the cowboy did not face it alone. And for the first time in her life, the woman did not feel like prey. Together, they were not merely survivors. They were a force that the land itself had acknowledged. Their journey was far from over, and the horizon would surely bring new trials. Yet the legend of the woman who refused to be broken and the cowboy who could not turn away was already written. It lived in the canyon silence, in the scars upon their skin, and in the whispers of the wind across the plains. And though the West would test them again, their bond had already proven stronger than the whip, stronger than the gun, stronger even than the silence of the desert itself. The tale of the woman scarred by the whip and the cowboy who chose not to turn away is more than a story of survival. It is a mirror held up to the human spirit. She entered his life as a stranger, wounded and hunted, yet in her defiance, she became more than a victim. She became proof that even in the harshest of lands, resilience can outshine cruelty. The cowboy, hardened by solitude, discovered that true strength does not come from standing alone, but from standing with someone who dares to fight beside you. Through their battles, we see that the West was never just a place of dust and blood. It was a place where character was tested in every breath. The whip, the storm, the drought, the outlaw, all were trials that revealed who they truly were. And together, they showed that dignity cannot be stolen by violence, and freedom cannot be silenced by fear. Their scars became not marks of shame, but symbols of endurance, carved into them by a land that spares no one. Their story reminds us that the greatest legends are not born from riches or power, but from courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It was not the cowboy's gun that made him unforgettable, nor the woman's suffering that defined her. It was the choice to endure, to rise when the world tried to bury them, and to carve a place for themselves in a land that wanted them forgotten. That is the truth the West teaches us. Survival alone is not enough. What matters is the spirit with which you endure. As the fire of their journey burns in our memory, it leaves a question that lingers long after the dust is settled. When cruelty or injustice stands before you, will you turn away, or will you dare to step forward, knowing the cost? Their bond was forged not in comfort, but in battle, proving that the fiercest flames create the strongest steel. And though the horizon held new storms, they had already become more than wanderers. They had become a legend etched into the very wind. If this story stirred something within you, let it live beyond these words. Share your thoughts in the comments, for every voice adds to the fire of remembrance. And if you wish to walk further into the Old West, where every tale carries both hardship and hope, subscribe to the channel, and leave your mark with a like. Your presence here keeps these stories alive, turning echoes of the past into lessons for today and legends for tomorrow.